Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and my mission is to use this space to bring content to you to help you understand your struggle with food and break free from binge eating. In today's video, I wanted to address a question that was left in the comments of a previous video, and the question was, how do I know what is causing my binge eating? It made sense to me then to create a video about the causes of binge eating and to share a few pointers, a few questions you can ask yourself about each one to help you figure out which one of these is likely to be driving your binge eating. Some of them are going to be the big obvious ones that I've talked about before, and there may be a couple of others that perhaps you haven't thought about in this way that might be useful for you to consider. So the first one, the most obvious one that comes up time and time again, is restriction. If you are not eating enough, you may be more vulnerable to binge eating. Diets have a pretty poor success rate. There are some people that seem to be able to diet without having compulsive eating afterwards, but it seems that a lot of people do not fall into that category. So are you somebody who is overly focused on losing weight? Is that your sole obsession? Is your weight going up and down? Are you trying to put in these really tight reins about what you're eating? Are you planning pretty restrictive days to try and see big changes in your weight? If so, this might be one that's going on for you. And I know this is very difficult to let go of if weight loss is really important to you. Just focus on the now. What is it you need now to feel better? If you're struggling with binge eating and you're physically trying to restrict, can you put that on the back burner and focus on addressing the binge eating behavior? Whether you go back to it or not, you can decide that in the future. You don't need to think about that now. Now just focus on what is it that you need, because if your physical restriction is causing you to binge eat, it's always going to keep moving you away from your goal anyway. So consider whether you can put that aside, at least for now. I would want to say forever, but I appreciate that may not feel possible for everyone, and you don't need to decide now what it is you're going to do forever. And the second part of restriction is the mental restriction. So for me, when I first was trying to research and understand my binge eating, all this talk about restriction just didn't make sense to me. I hear a lot of people talking about binge eating and they say how they're really good at dieting, and that might be you. You might be good at dieting, but then the binging comes back. I was never good at dieting. I think I managed to diet to the point where I lost any significant amount of weight only once in my life. So for me, it was a lot about that mental restriction, and that often shows up in Last Supper eating. So that's the idea where you are eating, you feel like you've blown it, you've gone over whatever it was you said that you were going to eat that day. You think, oh, I've messed up. I might as well eat everything now because tomorrow I'll do better. That's what the Last Supper eating is. And for me, for a long period of time, I was doing that every day. Every day, I was planning to be much more controlled the next day. And what that did is it kept making the present day even more out of control, because it felt like my last opportunity to eat all these foods. So that was a big part of what was driving my binge eating, along with a few other things as well, but that definitely perpetuated it. Another cause of binge eating, which comes up fairly regularly, is the idea of emotional eating or mood regulation. So food can be a way of feeling better, particularly if you struggle with depression and perhaps almost from a neurochemical perspective, your happy hormones, for want of a better word, are out of whack. Food can be a way of feeling a bit better, or if you can't actually feel better with food, maybe it's better to feel numb. This often shows up for people who perhaps their eating is more spread out throughout the day. People who are using binge eating for mood regulation tends to be more frequent binges and not necessarily as big. Sometimes they are as big, but not necessarily. The ones where the binges tend to be bigger, that are also linked to mood, is the next one I wanted to mention, which is a trauma response. Sometimes people's binge eating can be triggered off by a traumatic event. So it can be an assault, it can be abuse, but it can be something that on the outside seems smaller and more benign. It can be growing up as a kid and having parents that punished you for like emotional outbursts, for having feelings. So you start to believe that your emotions must be wrong. And so somehow along the way, you discover that food helps with this, helps you feel a bit better, helps to push something down. If your binge eating is related to this, chances are what food does is it provides a sense of safety. So if for you there's something about food and safety, there's potentially a link to some kind of trauma. And trauma can be what didn't happen as well as something that actually did happen. And it's a really tricky and complicated subject because it can be completely outside of our awareness. There's been a lot of work and theorizing as well done because it's really hard to find a very concrete answer around this, but our early feeding experiences can have an impact on how we are with food later on. So if as a baby you were left to cry when you were hungry, that could create a sense of safety around food, and you would never know that that was what happened. This is why this stuff is difficult to talk about in a way that people can relate to and resonate with. So if food is safety, consider it might be a trauma response. The next one that I feel really doesn't get talking about. The next one that really doesn't get spoken about or talked about in the psychology world so much when it comes to food is around hormones and the influence of hormones on our eating. The appetite is a very powerful system in our bodies, and it's related to all these different chemical processes, and they're all interlinked, and it's so complex. We don't really understand enough yet about this. We understand such a tiny amount when it comes to our hormones and how they interact with one another in the body as well. So if we take some of the major hormones like estrogen, thyroid hormones, testosterone, cortisol, all these more commonly known ones, all of those have been shown to impact appetite in one way or another. So if you are hormonally dysregulated, maybe you've experienced this in your menstrual cycle, that there are times when you have this ravenous hunger, it's like this hormonal hunger that can never be fully satisfied. Or another common one I see is when people hit menopause. Estrogen is it's an appetite suppressant. So when estrogen is high, your appetite is lower. So in menopause, when estrogen's going up and down, but it's mainly going down, that can have a big impact on your appetite as well. So if you find yourself eating more and then you're gaining weight, and now you reach for restriction because you're concerned about your eating and your weight gain, that is another time when people's binge eating can be triggered. It's quite common to see that for people that develop binge eating later on in life. Another one that I want to talk about really carefully, because I feel like people don't talk about this with any nuance, they're at one side of it or the other side of it, is that certain foods have what I like to call rusty breaks, which means we can start eating them and our brains and bodies don't necessarily say stop. Or they don't say stop as soon as they might with other foods. So if you're going to have a binge, it's very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to binge 1,500 calories of fruits and vegetables. For most people, there are certain types of food that are easier to binge on than others. And we live in an environment now where we have more of those foods around us. So this can be influencing. I'm not saying that I think these foods cause binge eating, because I don't think it's the food itself that's the problem. I believe there has to be other factors at play, otherwise everybody would have a problem with these foods. But these foods are designed to stimulate the reward system in the brain. So I don't think food addiction is a helpful label, and I think the label causes more problems than it fixes. But it does mean that certain types of foods, if they impact the reward pathways, you can have an addictive-like relationship with them, and they can cause addictive-like behaviors. The next one, this one might sound a bit strange to some of you. This is kind of in the realm of psychotherapy, and it's this idea of food as this object that we can play out unconscious patterns around. Okay, well, what does that mean? So let's say a common story I hear is people at a young age being put on diets and restriction by their parents, 8, 9, 10 years old. And so food becomes this way to kind of get one up on their parents. It's a way of expressing freedom and autonomy because they weren't allowed to decide what they wanted to put into their own bodies. So it can be this way of constantly proving that they're free. Even though now as an adult they are free to make their food decisions, no one outside of them is likely to be stopping them. Because as a child that became this developed pattern of rebellion against control, because we want to be free. So that can be one way of playing a pattern out with food. Or in the case of someone who spends their life looking after other people and giving to other people as well, food becomes that one place where they can give something back to themselves. So even though in the long term it feels like it's taking more from them, it's this momentary pattern where it feels like, okay, I've given. No one gives to me. I have to give to myself, and I don't know how to do it, and I'm going to reach for food, and this is how I'm learning to give to myself, because I haven't developed, maybe I wasn't in an environment where people offered to meet my needs and it didn't feel okay for me to ask for my needs to be met. So food can become this way, this sort of dysregulated pattern of trying to meet a need that we're struggling to get elsewhere. So this is about food taking on all kinds of symbolic meanings and then that playing out in our behaviour with it. The last one, I think this deserves a mention. It's not normally a cause, but it could be what's causing the binge eating to continue, and that is habit. So any of the reasons that I've mentioned before might have been initial triggers for you, and those reasons may no longer exist. You may no longer be restricting, you may no longer have dysregulated hormones, but your behaviour around food may be still problematic. The brain anticipates, we get into these patterns, we get used to certain things being available or happening at certain times. So you can normally tell if it's habit for you if you are someone who binges on schedule. So there are certain days, certain times and certain situations that you always binge in. So you can see a real pattern to your binge eating. If that's the case, there's quite a clearly defined pattern. Habit's going to be around somewhere. And habits are powerful. It's not, if you're realizing yours is a habit, it's not a case of going, I just won't do that anymore. Because for most people that doesn't feel possible. It might be about trying to create new habits or trying to just shift the habits a bit to try and take away the automatic nature of what it is that you are habitually playing out with food. And of course, it's highly probable that you may be experiencing a combination of these. Even if that's the case, I generally see that people can pick out one or two as being the predominant causes of their binge eating. So hopefully that was helpful. I appreciate I haven't been able to get into what to do about all of these. I cover quite a lot of that in other videos that I've done, but hopefully this will help you to just deepen your understanding of what's going on for you around food. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next video.